Select committees will draw on a very wide range of sources during their inquiries, but when we talk about evidence, we're talking about material that was prepared specially for the committee and is published by the committee on its own website. The committee won't accept as formal evidence material that's already published elsewhere, so if you've got an article in the newspaper or in a journal, for example, they'll read it, but they won't accept it as evidence. Your evidence can refer to material that's already published elsewhere and it can summarise it, and it's usually better if you can produce a simple summary of what might be quite a dense academic paper.
The things to remember is that the committees can't use anything that's already been published. So if you have an article that's really relevant, you can send it to them as background, but actually you need to write something that's new for the committee.
There are two reasons that select committees won't accept as formal evidence something that's already published elsewhere. One is obviously the cost of republishing something that's already out there in the public domain. The other is that evidence to select committees attracts a special set of legal protections called parliamentary privilege. And if we were to publish under parliamentary privilege material that was already published elsewhere, and it were somehow to become subject to any legal proceedings, then that could create all kinds of complexity. So as a general rule, evidence to select committees has to be something that's prepared specially for the committee. Very often it's a summary of stuff that's already out there. So a 500-word summary of an academic article, for example, would be perfectly acceptable as select committee evidence, provided it wasn't something you'd already published as a blog, for example.
Once you've submitted something to the committee, they do hold the copyright on that. But if you want to use it again, then just talk to the clerk, and permission is really usually granted for you to be able to go and publish that somewhere else.
The key things when you're submitting evidence to a select committee are to make sure that it's relevant to the inquiry the committee is doing, and preferably to explain why it's relevant if that's not immediately obvious, and to stick to any guidelines the committee's put on its website. Often there's a word length, for example, usually about 2,000 words, and committees like evidence to be submitted in particular formats through their own web portal.
Doesn't have to be long, doesn't have to be very in-depth, and it doesn't have to be new research, but just writing a couple of pages that answer at least some of the questions that they've posed in the inquiry and using your research as evidence in that, that's the way to really get it to stand out.
There's no harm in ringing up a committee clerk and talking through the inquiry and discussing what kind of evidence might be useful to the committee. If you're interested in giving oral evidence, it's usually worth saying so at an early stage. You won't necessarily be called because committees have many more people wanting to give evidence than they have time to hear from, but it's worth flagging up that you might be interested.
Well, a policy brief in the humanitarian sector is, I imagine, what a policy brief is in a load of other places. So quite a short, concise document that addresses a particular problem and offers recommendations for resolving that issue. So in terms of structure, it would generally start with a brief note on the wider context, then an outline of what the specific concerns are and issues are, and then the final section will typically be recommendations that will be formatted in bullet points rather than prose. And policy briefs tend to be, I would say, 2 to 4 pages, at most 6.
There's no standard format for a policy brief, and they're often known by lots of different names like standard notes and research papers.
The lengths vary from anything as short as 1 page up to round about 8 or 9 pages, and some of that depends on the complexity of the issue that you're talking about. The structure also tends to vary depending on the issue, but often they have a sort of background or context section, then sections around the topic itself, and then concluding sections or recommendations. The most useful briefings, I think, are the ones that summarise a whole set of research. So aren't ones that just talk about an individual research project, but try and draw together or synthesise findings from a range of research and even a range of disciplines to try and make it most useful for the policymaker who's trying to deal with a real world problem. And also, it's quite a good idea to have suggestions for further reading or places where policymakers can go if they actually want some more detail than you can cover in that short space. So then they could follow up with you or read full articles if that's what they wanted. Post, where I work, produces 4-page policy briefings called Post Notes, which aim to summarise all of the literature on a particular area for MPs and peers as they come to have to try and debate and legislate around particular issues.
The House of Commons Library and the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology produce a lot of briefing for MPs, and it's all available online, so my best advice is to go and look at that. Have a look at the library standard notes, which tend to be background papers on ongoing issues of interest, and the research papers, which tend to be targeted more at particular debates in the chamber, particular pieces of legislation, changes in government policy and so on. Look at a few of those and that will give you a very good idea of the kind of structure and content that MPs are used to seeing.
So when you're writing a policy brief, the second part of that phrase is the important one: brief. Make it brief, make it relevant.